Hi, hello, and welcome everybody to another episode of the Shifting Gears podcast. Today I am your host, Greg Caldera. I'm an Associate Marketing Manager here at Spectrum Automotive Holdings, and this podcast is brought to you by Spectrum Automotive Holdings. We're really excited to have our guest on the show today. He's one of our very own, Justin LaRocque. He'll be talking about starting a podcast today, and we want to welcome anybody who's new to this podcast. This podcast is for anybody and everybody in the automotive industry. It gives us a little bit of background about the industry, and hopefully we're able to provide you with a little bit of insight as to what is going on in the automotive world. Getting right into it, I'll introduce our guest today, Justin LaRocque. Justin, how's it going?
What's going on, Greg? I appreciate the intro, man. I'm excited to do it. As you know, I'm usually on the other side of this podcast interviewing others, so I appreciate you taking some time to, step in and be the host.
Yeah, glad to do it. It's got a little bit of a reversed role for you, so
Yep.
We're really excited about this episode today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm Justin LaRocque. I am the marketing manager for Spectrum Automotive, the one who kind of helped put this whole podcast together in the first place, and started to interview people and things like that. I'm also very much into social media, and I think a lot of that stuff kind of ties together when it comes to creating content, putting whether it is video content or audio content or even just written content. It's something that I obviously work on throughout this company and all the companies we work with. So creating this podcast was a really cool idea. I think it's still in its early stages, I would say. We've only had a handful of guests so far, but right. I think that what we've done so far has been really good. And as you said, this is all for anyone and everyone that's in the automotive industry. So anyone can listen to this podcast and take something from it. You don't necessarily have to be like an owner of a dealership, or you could just be starting out. And I think that there's something beneficial for everybody on this podcast. So for me, I am very passionate about this stuff, and obviously that's why we chose this topic for me to talk about. So that's kind of where I stand.
Awesome. So as you just mentioned, you're very passionate about podcasts. So how long have you been listening to podcasts?
So I feel like I've been listening to podcasts for a long time. I mean, it's just like music. I mean, it's just something that's in. I've been using it for educational purposes, just trying to learn things about certain industries. It's also something just great to do as you're driving, if you have road trips or things like that.
Definitely.
So really convenient in that sense. I feel like certainly, gosh, the time flies. 15 years or so, in terms of just casually listening to podcasts. I'd have to say that'd probably be the date.
All right, great. Well, we've kind of touched on it, but you've been listening to them for a while. So why do podcasts excite you? What's special about this type of platform or channel that everybody can listen to as a podcast?
The main thing is this is a platform for long form content. So it's certainly not your TikTok or your Instagram of the world where you're just getting glimpses of certain content. But here's something where people, you legitimately sit down, you're expecting your audience to take time and actually listen to whatever it is that is being discussed on any given podcast. And so I think it's just, it's kind of like, it's almost like talk radio, essentially.
Right.
And obviously talk radio has been around for years, especially with things like sports and whatnot. So this is a cool platform because you're able to do it, you could do it about any content you want, any topic that you want. And you can do it with friends. Obviously, usually you're doing it you're talking with other people about it. Even now that I think about it, there are certainly podcasts out there that are, lone individuals speaking as well. But again, it's just a long form content that anybody can enjoy while they are, as I said before, like driving to work, or if they're on a plane, they're on a long distance commute of some sort. I even listen to podcasts while I'm cleaning around the house or cooking or anything like that. You're able to do that. I have a hard time keeping a straight face because I don't know why I said cooking. I personally don't cook, but that for those who cook, you certainly could be listening to a podcast while you're cooking.
Not talking from experience.
No, not at all, not at all. If my girlfriend's listening, she'll laugh at that. Yeah, I mean the other thing about podcasts is there's several different reasons why one might want to put a podcast together. There are a lot of them out there that are strictly for educational purposes. I used to listen to a lot of them for like self-help or motivation type topics. I mentioned before sports, like there are a ton of different avenues that you can go down about talking about specific teams or specific players or analytics and those kind of details. I mean, even like celebrities I know that are starting to now get more involved with podcasts or creating their own podcasts. One of the great things about this is it's free and it's easy to set up. I mean, you don't need much equipment or anything, and I know we'll probably touch on that later, but it's really easy to just kind of say, hey, I want to start a podcast. I want to do this with some friends or by myself or whatever the case may be, and you can just jump into it and start recording. The other big thing that I wanted to mention about podcasts in general is, as you start to put more content out there, more episodes or whatever you want to call them, you'll start to gain, hopefully you'll start to gain like a following, people that are listening to you on a regular basis. From my experiences and what I've done with podcasts and whatnot, I've certainly built a community. And so I think that that's a big takeaway from creating podcasts that a lot of people don't consider, is that it allows you to get, close with certain people, or to be able to have people get close to you in terms of you're showing off your personality, you're showing off like how you carry yourself. And if you're a likable person, then people are going to come back again and again. And I mean, I've certainly formed friendships outside of podcasts because of those things, or people that I listen to on a regular basis. I feel like I know them, from listening to certain podcasts. And so, I keep bringing up sports as an example, but if you listen to certain people long enough, and then maybe you run into them at an event or something, you almost feel like you know the person. So I think that this allows you to be like real, be yourself, and also have other people see that part of you. There's a bunch of reasons as to why this excites me, but overall I think there's just a lot of opportunity for anybody who wants to start their own channel or their own podcast.
So Justin, you did mention a little bit that you had some experience with podcasts yourself. So can you expand a little bit on those experiences that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. I went to school for audio engineering back in the day. That was one of my passions, was not just creating music, but recording music. So I learned a lot just from going to the audio schools that I had attended. Since then, my career has certainly changed and went into different directions, and marketing was not at first one of those avenues that I thought it'd go down. But luckily, because we're doing things like podcasts and videos and recording, a lot of the things that I learned from audio engineering, I was able to apply to what we are doing right now. So even for myself personally, yes, throughout the years I've done a ton of different podcasts, different ideas. I used to be a motivational speaker.
Wow.
And I used to work with others on just encouraging others to do more and to enjoy life and to not settle in life. That was like one of my main messages, was to really go after what it is that you enjoy or that you have passion for.
That's awesome.
And while I was doing that, I created a podcast for it because I wanted to make content. I wanted to show up on a regular basis. And obviously, self-help and motivation, there are tons of topics set on that, whether you're trying to motivate yourself from a personal standpoint, whether it has to do with your weight or your health or your family, your relationships, or if it's from a business standpoint, I was talking about a lot of those things as well, how to grow in your career, how to be a better worker, a better employee, things like that. So that was like a big experience for me when it came to learning how to actually, record podcasts. And, of course, as I mentioned before, I've been listening to podcasts for a very long time, so I do have that experience of it, of just kind of hearing how others have done it in the past, hearing people having certain intros, certain outros, the music that they choose, the formatting that they use, like, how do they do a Q&A type thing like we're doing, or do they have like, 2 or 3 people and they just take turns talking about a certain subject? Some people have guests on week to week like we're kind of doing. Other people just have like, the same person or people on every time. So it really depends, like, there's a lot of different things. But yeah, so from my experience with podcasts, and especially the recording side of things, like I said, the audio engineering part really helped me. And again, there's lots of different equipment and things like that that you could get into. But one of the first things you really got to understand and know is the layout and what your expectations are for that. So, but yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at with, my experience.
Awesome. That's really interesting because, you had so much experience with it and personally. But I guess I want to start to get into what some of the benefits are for a business standpoint if they want to start a podcast for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the for any business, in terms, I know that this is very dealership focused or automotive focused, but I do think it can be applied anywhere when it comes to creating a podcast. One of the things is education, just being the going in the route of education. Going in the route of enlightening other people on how to do something or how certain things are in an industry, things like that, kind of coming off as the experts. I mean, the more information that you put out there, the more value that you provide for other people, your listeners, the more often they're going to come back and want to hear more, listen more, and view you as the expert or the go-to. So if a dealership says that they want to have, I don't know, maybe some of their employees put something together, especially maybe, I don't know, some of the sales team members or the business managers, where they can like sit down and talk about like a day-to-day, what their day looks like. Or maybe you go to certain departments and you ask, you interview them and ask them like, what does your day look like at a dealership? And something to share. Or you could go the route, like I said before, with education, where you can actually teach others certain aspects, like educate them on the process of buying a car, like what that looks like. What do customers normally have to go through? What should customers be looking for? Like value that can actually help customers out, and give them general tips and not just sell them. I would say the selling side is probably the last thing you want to do about a podcast, because no one's going to want to listen. No one wants to listen to 5 seconds of someone trying to sell them, let alone 5 minutes or 5 hours.
Right.
So you have to keep that in mind when you are putting content together or coming up with ideas or topics. You want to have value for your listeners. Why should they come back? Why should they listen to you? And you got to answer those questions. So, but I do think that there's a lot of benefits to this from a business standpoint, because like I said, you're getting your name out there. You're able to grow your audience. You can tie this in very easily to social media. Greg, I know you know how passionate I am about social media and the idea that you can reach a lot of people through that. Well, podcasting is kind of another avenue of social media in a way, and certainly can play off of the others, where you can share and have other people reshare. I mean, things can go viral even, if you have the right clips or the right topics or whatever the case may be, where you can get discovered by other people. People are searching those kinds of things. So I think that as long as you are looking to provide value of some sort and not just sell, you're gonna have some success in the podcast world. The other angle that I was thinking about was from an internal standpoint. So you as a dealership or a dealer group, maybe you have an internal podcast where you have employees on, and this can help with your employee retention, like the culture at your actual company. Letting people have a voice. I mean, that's huge, especially within a company. So I think these are other ideas that dealers can take with them and say, hey, like if maybe you have enough people that just work at your dealership that would be interested in something like this, then maybe you do it. And maybe you keep it all internal on purpose, where it's like, all right, this is almost like a newsletter, like an internal newsletter, where it's like, all right, you got Billy and Jane, they're hanging out today talking about their day at this XYZ dealership, and let's hear, and then Billy shares about this and Jane explains that, and then the next week or a month later you have another one, and this time you bring on Jessica and Chris, and have them talk about something completely different that maybe the rest of your dealership employees might be interested in. So again, that's like an internal idea, or you could do it as an external, where you're trying to get random viewers from the world to participate more. And then the other thing too, I mentioned earlier, just building community. I think it all kind of goes back to that. So if you are a dealership who your customers are ones that you've known for years and years and years, those loyal customers who come back to you every time, those are the kinds of people that you want to target as your audience and have them be listening, and really, I mean, you're almost including them like they're part of the family or part of the business in a way, like that they're you're their go-to dealership. And so because of that, you want to, on top of just keep providing great service and great cars and deals, you want to now have a platform where they can actually get to know the employees there a little bit more, get to know their personalities and things like that by having something like this, long form content like a podcast. So I think there's a lot of benefits for businesses in general.
So it seems like kind of what you're getting at is that, you kind of just want to make it your own, but you also want to make it educational and make it fun for everybody listening. That's one way that you can really start to expand your reach and your audience.
Yeah, and I mean, I was looking up some before. Just I was curious about what other automotive type podcasts are out there other than like what we're doing right now. And there's a ton. I mean, people are talking about like experiences with their cars. There's a whole group that collects cars and they just talk about like these classic cars that they own. There's ones that just talk about the history of certain cars, how they got developed, how they got made, maybe talking about kind of the future of where the car industry is going. Even I mentioned before, how-tos, how to fix a car, how to change a tire, educational topics like that can go a long way. So just some other, topics that I've seen some people already doing. And anybody listening to this right now, if you are working at a dealership or you own a dealership, these are certainly things you can consider for your own team.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I want to start to get into a little bit about how you would start a podcast. How do you decide on content? You kind of talked a little bit about, some ideas, but how do you really decide on what content you need and how you would start a podcast?
Yeah, so I think the first thing you have to do is define for yourself the purpose of starting this podcast. Why are you doing it? Are you doing it for fun? Are you doing it to help with branding purposes? Are you doing it to have better communication with your community or your clients or your customers? Or are you doing it to have better community with communication with internal use, like I was mentioning before? I think it's important to define for yourself, what do you expect to get out of this? How much time are you willing to put into something like this? Because Greg, as you know, this is not like necessarily a quick turnaround when it comes to recording a podcast, planning it out, especially when you have guests, every time. You have to figure out like what their schedule is like. Are they able to do it? When can they do it? So there's a lot of different things to go into it, but I think you have to define the goal first of like, what are you trying to achieve with this podcast, with the outcome of this? Are you trying to educate people? If you are, who's the audience? What does the audience look like? Defining what that is another big step. Is just, who do you expect to listen to this? Is it going to be other industry professionals? Or is it going to be customers, casual people who are not necessarily into cars per se, but might want to learn about certain aspects of the car industry? So there's a lot of those things to consider. And then another big thing too is just understanding that, like I mentioned, like this takes time. There's a process with this. And so as you're planning this out, ask yourself who's involved with this project. If you're a dealership and you're going to assign this to somebody, a project of some sort, whether maybe you do it in-house or you're hiring a third-party company to help you do this. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go about it, but you do want to kind of define like who's in charge of this, the creative side, who's going to come up with these topics, who's going to approve this stuff, who's going to edit this stuff, who's going to take the time to be the host. You want someone with energy and charisma and be able to carry a conversation casually like you and I are doing right now. You want to have that entertainment essentially to be added in. Even if you are going in an educational route, you still need to be entertaining to some degree.
Yeah.
So all these different things really are factors that tie in. And then, like I was saying before, like figuring out the actual topic. Once you define your goal, I think the topics kind of come with that. When you know who you're talking to and hoping that they're going to keep an ear to each and every episode that you do, I think that's going to the topics are going to naturally come. And especially if you're bringing on certain experts, certain people that know certain things or certain topics that they want to comfortably talk about, then all that stuff's got to be defined ahead of time. And then even for you and me, I mean, we try to prepare certain questions. I mean, these are casual conversations, but you certainly want a guideline a little bit, to see where the conversation might go, even if it does go off on a hard left turn or something like that. At least you had
keep it natural.
Yeah, at least you had some guideline to kind of fall back into at some point. So, there's a lot of things I know that I'm kind of, shouting out here, but these are things that I think anybody needs to consider when they are starting to develop their own podcast.
Right. So, you kind of define the goal and then everything else starts to fall into place, and then you can find out, who your audience is, and then, what you expect to talk about will just kind of come naturally with who you have on the podcast and everything like that.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
That's interesting because, I think it's helpful for anybody to try their hand at starting a podcast, and that's a great way to start deciding on content and everything.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of people look at this as an intimidating platform, that, I mean, just like anything else, I mean, any other content, especially like recording and, you know, things like that, like your voice is on, you know, being captured essentially, and that can be a little nerve wracking too. But like, I think that, you know, people that are just starting out, you should just give it a shot. You know, I mean, worst comes to worst, you just never use the content, right?
Right.
So
kind of like, what do you have to lose?
Yeah, right. And I always tell people, you know, I mean, we talked about, like, we don't really have a script here. It was just a conversation. But that's the best way to, I personally think that's the best way to go about it, because you're getting natural personalities. You're getting the realness of an individual and not something forced or robotic, which, again, people that are, your audience is not going to want to listen to something that someone is reading, you know, the entire time. If that's the case, they'll just buy an audiobook or something like that, or just read a book themselves. So you want to be able to have personalities that come off in a way that's natural, not scripted. And I think this, like, the interview style is perfect. And so for anyone that is starting, the other thing too is, if you're not sure who would be good for this type of stuff, find the 2 or 3 people in the office that, like, talk the most, you know, that are just, like, you know, just about anything, about the weather, about sports, about whatever casual conversations that they have. And you can see that they're comfortable with speaking in that sense, because that's really what this is. That's what we're doing right now. We're just having a conversation. You know, every time that I am hosting this show and bringing on a guest, that's one of the biggest things that I remind the guest of that time, is just like, hey, at the end of the day, we're just having a conversation. There's no cameras, there's no nothing. Pretend like we're not even recording anything, and let's just talk. You know, let's just talk. Let me just ask you some questions, and if you and I were just sitting at a coffee table or something, how would you answer these questions? You know, so I think that these are all things to consider when it comes to this. I think a lot of people, like, have these expectations, like, oh, you need to have, you know, this Hollywood setup. You need to have these bright lights. You need to have these fancy recording, you know, microphones and all this stuff. But it's really not the case. You know, sure, like, a lot of that stuff can come down the road. But when it comes to really just executing and putting yourself out there and seeing if it works to begin with, I think it's best to just sit down, hit the record button, and just let it run. You know.
Definitely. I agree. And I know, actually, we've kind of talked about it all throughout this podcast here, but I want to start to see if you have any suggestions on equipment, you know, like what goes into it, and what would you suggest new or experienced podcasters use?
Yeah, so great question. I think that, you know, nowadays, right now, I know that in certain parts of the world, it's still, you know, there has to be a separation, you know, with the pandemic and things like that, and people being cautious. But, you know, there are things to consider, like, you know, do you have, if you have a partner or a co-host that you're going to have, or a guest of some sort, are they going to be in the office with you, in the room with you, or are they recording from another house or another building, another office of some sort? Then I think that one of the easiest way to go about this is just trying something like Zoom or some other digital, you know, meeting application that you can use, where you and your friend or your co-host can just, you know, have that conversation over the internet, and just hit, you know, a lot of these, like Zoom, I know, like, you can record these things and capture it that way. Now, you are recording the visual too, but there are editing tools later that you can then just take the audio from, and that's it right there. But if you wanted to get a little more in depth with, like, equipment and stuff like that, I would say use what they call, like, a Tascam recorder. I mean, if you go look up Tascams on like Amazon.com or something like that, then you'll see a bunch of different ones. You can find used ones, older ones. So you don't really need anything fancy. I mean, I think there's Tascams out there for like $50 or $60, you know, maybe $100, something like that, for something brand new. Mm-hmm. And then you just need like a microchip that will record, you know, that will capture the memory card that will capture the audio. And those have built-in microphones. So what's cool about a Tascam is you can just place that in the middle of a table and you can just talk, and it'll capture everything, you know. So if you and the co-host that you're having, or the guest that you're having, is sitting across the table from you, then that's perfect. You can just use one of those, or if you want to get even more fancier, you can order like a lavalier mic, something that can like attach to your shirt or your tie or your jacket, something that you might see on like on TV or something like that, you know, people interviewing and things like that. They have something on their button-ups, so that you get a little bit better quality. One thing to keep in mind too, with, you know, not just equipment, but the editing side of it, I know that can be or sound intimidating to have to do, but I would say if you're new to this, don't get too caught up in the editing. Just work on, you know, do it, try to keep the conversation in one take. And then there are tons of different like editing software out there that you could either download, or there's free ones I'm sure that you can use, like GarageBand or something like that from Apple, something like that you could use and just drop the audio in and trim stuff. Like I was saying earlier, there are a ton of like, you'll hear podcasts with music and ones with intros and outros and all this fancy stuff. While it is like, the cool, I'm doing air quotes for people who don't see this, while it's not the cool, or while that is the cool thing to do is have that stuff, it's certainly not a requirement in any way. I know a lot of podcasts that are out there that just start with a conversation. It's just a person saying, hey, and we're back, welcome back, and that's just it. So I feel like, don't feel obligated to, have all these fancy bells and whistles, at least not in the beginning. All that will come. I would say just dive in first, use like Zoom or anything else, and just kind of get started and see how it comes out there. And then if that works, then you start doing research, just like anything else that you would do, just like buying a car or anything like that. You'd want to take some time, do some research. I mentioned Tascam because that's one that I've used for a while. I'm very familiar with it. But there's a ton of other tools and equipment that you could use as well to kind of capture these types of things, whether you're out and about or you're in an office or you're doing it virtually online.
All right, cool. So you kind of want to just start out simple, basic, and then if you want, work your way up. But, it's not a requirement.
Right.
But I guess I want to see what you feel makes for a good podcast overall,
Yeah, so you definitely want music at the beginning. No, I'm just kidding. Now the main thing I would say is for anybody is you want just solid topics. You want things that people are genuinely interested in, and this goes back to like, you don't want to just have salesy topics the entire time because no one wants to be sold to, but you want actual topics that are valuable to others. We've had guests on this particular podcast that have talked about things like automotive reinsurance or careers in automotive or women in automotive, like all these different topics that there are people out there who want to hear about these things. They want to know more about these things and see what others are saying about certain topics. So I think that really figuring out for yourself, one, what are the topics that we want to discuss, and then two, the execution of them, and by that I mean like the actual people talking about them. The biggest thing is you don't want to have somebody who doesn't care about the topic on. That might sound obvious, right? But you want someone who's like passionate about this stuff. You want someone who knows what they're talking about, someone who is very well educated in that specific area. And again, this all goes back to like finding out, again, if you're in a dealership, who is comfortable talking about what are they comfortable talking about? Where do their passions lie? What are they most interested in? Because that's when you're going to get the natural answers. That's when you're going to get a natural flow of back and forth discussions. Whereas, like I said earlier, you don't want to have just this robotic, individual trying to force certain content, onto a recording. Like you want them to actually have things that people are interested in. You want to know that the person talking is genuinely interested in this. Like, I would hope that people recognize that I have a passion for this type of stuff because, I'm excited. I'm excited for this stuff. And I'd love to see more people out in the world, putting together podcasts, whether it is for a business standpoint or a personal standpoint, like whatever angle that it is that you want to go about. But I think that it's a very underutilized platform that just not enough people are doing, and who knows, the next successful podcast where it can just blow up, and next thing you know, you might have celebrities on as guests and things like that. So anything can happen, but I would say really come up with those topics. Decide if you want to be more on the entertaining side, or more on the educational side. Define that for yourself. I talked about goals earlier. Define, what is the purpose of the podcast to begin with? What are you trying to capture? Who do you think your audience is? Who's going to take time to actually listen into this? And really think about like what do those people want to continue to listen to, and that's how you can kind of continue to build on those. But I think the topics and just being real, being yourself, being genuine are the two like top things to really consider, and that's what makes a great podcast. I think that's what makes something really hit a home run. So
awesome. I think that's awesome, and I think a lot of people can take a bunch of topics and things like that to the next level just by listening to this one itself. I think that's really all the questions we've had for you today. we can't thank you enough for taking the time to explain some of what goes into a podcast and how starting a podcast can help a bunch of different aspects of your business and your following. So with that, we just kind of want to let people know, where can people find you?
Yeah, in terms of social media, on a professional standpoint, LinkedIn is definitely the way to go. If you just go to LinkedIn, the search bar there for Justin LaRocque, you can find me there. Also on the Spectrum website. I mean, just listening to podcasts like these, I'll be doing more of these as the host here for Shifting Gears, and it's been a lot of fun. It's just been a really good opportunity, I think, for a lot of different people. We're going to have more guests on. I've had a lot of great conversations. This has been an awesome conversation, and looking forward to doing more of that. So if anybody has any questions, even if it has to do with equipment or layouts or just other information like that, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, we thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing you back in the host seat, or maybe even back in the interviewee seat.
I was going to say, I don't know, Greg, the host seat, you did a pretty good job today, so I don't know if you might take my job in that aspect, and maybe I'll be the behind-the-scenes guy from here on out. But no, I appreciate it, man, and thanks for having me. And looking forward to more of these. Like you said, being in whichever seat I'm in, I'm down for it. So thanks again, man. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Anytime, of course. So we want to thank everybody listening out to the podcast for taking the time out and really finding out what Justin had to say about starting a podcast. We look forward to our next episode, and I'm your host, Greg Caldera. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Reach out to me with any questions that you may have, or if you need to get in contact with Justin. He mentioned his social media channels. So with that, I will say goodbye, and until next time.